Now, the Ruger Mark series has had so much success because of its affordability and its reputation for reliability and pretty good accuracy. And it's because of that low cost and its reputation for reliability and accuracy, and also the reputation of Ruger as a company, that I've recommended this pistol to people in the past who were looking for a first handgun or a starter handgun, especially if they were interested in learning how to shoot. Because learning how to shoot, knowing how to shoot, and simply owning a firearm are two completely different things. And even though I'd shot a few Rugers in the past, I'd always felt a little weird recommending this pistol because I'd never personally owned it. It's always a little bit different when you actually own the thing and you can do whatever you want with it. What always held me up on purchasing one was that the Ruger Mark 1s, 2s, and 3s, while they were more classically styled and to my liking from that aspect, they had a reputation of being pretty annoying guns to field strip and maintain. Now, the Ruger Mark IV, on the other hand, completely solved that issue with the ingenious push-button takedown system, but none of the variants for the Mark IV really spoke to me or stood out to me, so I just never ended up getting one. That was until Ruger released this pistol last year, the 75th anniversary edition. I saw it on the cover of one of the gun magazines and immediately recognized it for what it was, which was a classically styled target pistol. I mean, it looks like you could have plucked it straight out of the 1950s. And that's exactly what this gun is designed to be. It's styled after the original target version of the Ruger Standard, known as the Mark I Target. And you can see side by side clear similarities between the two. On the upper half of the pistol, we have a blued steel upper, and it has a 6 7/8 inch tapered barrel with a very unique Patridge front sight that looks very similar to the barrel and front sight assembly of the original Mark I Target. Also, like the Mark I Target, it has an adjustable rear sight. And like most of the Ruger Mark pistols, it has that bolt that's left in the white, which contrasts sharply against the blued steel. Now, the Mark IV 75th Anniversary Edition also comes drilled and tapped for a scope base, and on the right-hand side, you're gonna see some 75th Anniversary engraving, as well as on the back of the bolt. Moving on to the lower, while most of the Mark IVs have either a black trigger and some of them have a gold trigger, the Mark IV 75th Anniversary Edition has this trigger that is silver. It's aluminum, I believe, but it's left in the white to make it look more like the original Mark I Target. It also has these nice checkered walnut grip panels that, with how dark they are, do a really good job of looking like an old piece of wood. A small, understated feature on these is that medallion on the grip. So normally this Ruger emblem would have a red background that we associate with Ruger, but after the passing of Alex Sturm in 1951, the Ruger Standard and Mark I pistols had that red background swapped out for a black background. And that's exactly what this pistol has. Of course, Alex Sturm was the co-founding member of Ruger, hence the company name till this day still being Sturm, Ruger & Company. A pretty cool detail. I'm not really sure when they went back to that red background emblem on the grip medallions. As you can see in the modern lineup of Mark IVs, they have the red grip medallion. Now, one major difference between the Mark IV and the older Ruger pistols is that the standard grip frame is actually made out of solid aluminum now, instead of a two-piece stamped sheet metal assembly that used to be welded together. In my opinion, I think solid aluminum is a better construction over that stamped sheet metal thing. I think also the stainless steel models of the Mark IV actually come with a solid stainless steel grip frame as well. Now, I'll be the first person to say that I bought this pistol for its looks primarily, but even from a feature set standpoint, this was really the best deal on a Mark IV at the time, even better than the Mark IV Target. It came in right at $4 you can find it cheaper online, and it comes with a 6 7/8 inch barrel versus the 5.5 inch barrel on the standard Target model, and it comes with, in my opinion, a much better front sight with this nice deep undercut. That longer barrel is important because a longer sight radius is pretty much always going to be to your benefit when it comes to precision shooting, which this pistol was designed for, being modeled after a 1950s target gun, which no doubt would have been designed for the bullseye shooter or the international shooting market at that time. So with all that said, I think this gun does an excellent job of looking like a classically styled 1950s target pistol. Really, I don't know how someone at Ruger managed to convince the higher-ups to make a pistol that looks like this and has this feature set in the modern day. But despite how it looks, how does it perform? Before I talk about performance, I want to talk about this video's sponsor, Michael Scott Earl. Michael Scott Earl is a New York Times best-selling author, and he writes a lot of action-adventure books that are set in usually a sci-fi or fantasy setting. The current series of his that I'm reading, or rather listening to, is the Star Justice series, and that is a sci-fi action adventure. You can actually get the first book in that series for free by clicking the link down in the description below or following the link on screen. You can get it for free in either ebook or audiobook format. And in addition to his books being very well written, that is one thing I really like about his books, is that they're pretty much all available in audiobook format. And the audiobooks actually feature really good voice acting. So it's not just a guy that sounds like Morgan Freeman narrating a book, you know, reading you a bedtime story sort of thing. So it keeps you engaged. And like I said, the writing is good, so that keeps you engaged as well. So if that sounds like something that interests you, go ahead and check it out. So thank you to Michael Scott Earl for sponsoring the channel. All right, so to be totally honest, when it comes to performance, my first impression when I pulled it out of its decidedly retro cardboard box was not very positive. Immediately I picked it up and I dry fired it, and the trigger did not impress me at all. In fact, I thought it was a pretty bad trigger. Not only was it gritty and inconsistent, but it had so much over travel that it does this thing that when I looked down the sights and I pulled the trigger on this pistol, the over travel would cause me to push my front sight over to the right as the shot broke. Of course, the goal with shooting is essentially to line up the sights and pull the trigger without introducing any undue movement into those sights, and thus the gun. Again, this pistol, because it had so much over travel, was causing me to push that front sight off to the right every time I pulled the trigger, unless I held the gun in a really awkward way that shoved my index finger farther through the trigger guard than was comfortable. Now, the grip angle is not what I prefer, but I'll also tell you that grip angle is one of the least important things when it comes to shooting a handgun well. The most important things are going to be sight alignment, sight picture, and trigger control. So with that said, the important parts of a pistol usually when it comes to extracting accuracy out of it is having a good trigger and having good sights. And I am happy to say that the sights on the Ruger Mark IV 75th Anniversary Edition are actually pretty excellent, with a few caveats. The front sight has a little bit of a round edge right on the very tip. I'd rather that be a little bit sharper. That rounded edge kind of catches the light and bounces it back in your face. The easiest way to solve that is to take a lighter and just kind of blacken the tip of that front sight, which is exactly what I did. And that got rid of that reflection pretty easily. The rear sight has a nice square notch that leaves you two narrow bands of light either side of that front sight. A pretty good sight picture in my opinion. The balance of this pistol is actually pretty nice. It balances very similarly to the 5.5-inch bull barrel model, but it does have that longer barrel that's tapered. That's probably why. It balances right at about the trigger finger. It's not as heavy overall as I would prefer, and it's not as muzzle heavy as I would like, but it is muzzle heavy enough and heavy enough overall to help you stay on target as you're lining up on the bullseye. So not being very impressed with my first few dry fires on the pistol, I thought this gun wasn't going to shoot very well, and I was just going to maybe put a box of ammo through it and call it a looker more than a shooter. Two additional things that I hope to test with this firearm was that I put no lubrication on it other than what it came with from the factory. So it did have a light film of grease or oil on it that it came shipped from the factory with, and I didn't put any additional lubricant on it. I wanted to see when or if it failed and at what point. The other thing I wanted to test was I wanted to see if the front sight would loosen up and fly off of me. I'd heard a first-hand account of someone's set screw here walking out on them and the front sight flying off, and then I'd also read about it on a forum. The same thing happened to someone. So I wanted to see if this single set screw that's holding in the front sight would walk out on me. So I got a box of ammo, took it out to the range, and I posted up a B8 target up at 25 yards, and I decided to shoot all 5-shot groups just to zero the pistol at first, and I was shooting it at a pace that I call a time fire pace, basically about a shot every 4 to 5 seconds. Kind of looks like this. Now, my first ever group I shot with this, I was actually pretty impressed. I noticed it was a little bit low and to the left, so I moved the sights over right and up, and then I shot another group. Again, a pretty decent group, still a little bit low left, so I pushed it right and up again. Shot another group, moved the sights again, and I was still wondering when I was going to start seeing the groups open up. Well, I dumped 15 more rounds into this target just to confirm my zero after finding center, and I went down range, and in those 30 shots, the group didn't open up at all. So now I was, one, impressed, and two, kind of confused because, like I said, in dry fire, I was having that issue where my sights would move as the shot broke, but on paper, that's not manifesting at all. So on that first target, I'd shot 30 shots. and I decided I was going to finish up the box of ammo shooting on another target, so I shot 20 shots on this next target. Now at this point the trigger was still gritty and inconsistent, and on my very first string I ended up pulling 2 shots really low left into the 9 ring, and I'm almost certain that's because I was just being a little bit too hot on the trigger. But every group after that was very good. In fact, my last 2 groups ended up being a 100 with 7 X's. So I'd started off thinking I was just gonna shoot 1 box of ammo and put it away, but when a gun is shooting that well, you don't wanna just stop shooting mid-session. So I opened up some more ammo and I shot a clean target with 10 shots just to see what it would shake out to, considering that my last 10 shots had been 100 with 7 X's. So I broke into a new box of ammo and I shot this target at 25 yards, 10 shots, a total score of 108 X's. And if you look at the group size of this target, it's pretty freaking impressive. So horizontally it's 1 7/8 inches and vertically it's 1 3/4 inches. And if I subtracted the worst shot from this group, it would turn that horizontal spread to 1 1/4 inches at 25 yards. Even though that trigger was gritty and inconsistent and I didn't really like it, for some reason I was just shooting this pistol extremely well, and I was waiting for that trigger and that little wiggle in dry fire to eventually show up on paper. So at this point I'd proven to myself that the sights can be used to achieve a high degree of precision, and the barrel is certainly capable of the mechanical accuracy, which we kind of know already. Pretty much all blowback fixed barrel 22 pistols are capable of pretty much the same level of accuracy. That is, all of them are pretty much capable of breaking any record in any sport anywhere in the world, but it's up to the shooter to extract that mechanical accuracy. So I was able to extract the mechanical accuracy out of the sights, but that trigger was really my major sticking point. So I decided the way I was going to test that trigger was by bumping up the difficulty, and instead of shooting at my own pace, where I can really focus on getting a smooth, consistent trigger pull through that grit, through those starts and fits that the trigger was having, I decided I was going to shoot rapid fire. So in Bullseye, rapid fire is 5 shots in 10 seconds, and you do that twice for a total of 10 shots before you go down and score and replace your targets. Kind of looks like this. And shooting rapid fire is when things kind of started to fall apart, but not in a sense that I was having bad groups, but in a sense that I was slowing way down to achieve those groups. The trigger was actually forcing me to slow down. So as you can see on this rapid fire target, the numerical score was 498 and 30 something X's out of 500 points, so I took 50 shots on this target. But in the top left, you can see my scribbles. I had a shot go over the time limit on pretty much every single string, and that's entirely because of the trigger. So let me describe how this trigger was feeling at this point in time. Not only was it very gritty, it would actually have almost like a false set. You'd come up to a wall after taking up the pre-travel, and then you'd push through that wall, and then you'd be on a second wall, and then the trigger would break very crisply at that point. And overall, it was just very inconsistent. Sometimes it would have that false set, sometimes it wouldn't. Other times it'd be gritty, sometimes it would have like a nice roll to it. It just was not consistent, and what that was causing me to do, and what that will cause you to do in your shooting, is slow down, because in rapid fire, before the targets turn or before the beeper goes up, you want to have pressure on the trigger already. Well, when you have a trigger that's this inconsistent, it makes you apprehensive to put pressure on the trigger, because you don't want to shoot a shot before the target's turn because you're going to miss the target, and you don't want to shoot a shot before the beeper goes off because that doesn't count. The other thing with rapid fire is that in between shots, when you're recovering from recoil, you want to be putting pressure on that trigger as your sights are aligning, and you basically want the shot to break. You want to time it so that the shot breaks at the near exact moment that the front sight aligns in the center of that rear sight notch. When you have a trigger like this that's inconsistent and gritty and operates in fits and starts, is that instead of pulling the trigger as the sights are aligning, I was waiting for the sights to be perfectly aligned before starting my trigger pull, because I didn't want to have any shots that went off early before the sights were perfectly aligned, because obviously that would end up with a shot going way up high in the 8, 7, maybe even 6 ring. So combine not putting a significant amount of pressure on the trigger before the timer went off, and also the effects of slowing down between every shot to make sure my sights were centered before pulling the trigger, and you end up with me pulling the trigger way slower and going over time on pretty much every single string. So I wasn't going over time by much. I was going over time by maybe 2 or 3 seconds on every string, but of course in an actual competition, all of those shots past the timer realistically would mean the targets have already turned away from you, so you're not gonna hit the target. Those are misses. Not good, but here we see, again, the gun is performing. The gun is grouping. It's making a 4-inch, 3.5-inch group at 25 yards, no problem. Now, I just spent all of that time complaining about the trigger on this, but there was a silver lining to this. As I shot the gun more, the trigger became grittier, which might sound like a bad thing, but it was becoming consistently grittier. So instead of having those false walls and false sets and fits and starts, it was just kind of crunchy all the way through until it broke, which was an upgrade over what it was doing before. So for the last 40 shots, my first day shooting it, I decided I wasn't going to have any shots go over time. I was going to shoot the gun as fast as I felt comfortable, just confidently pulling through that gritty trigger and seeing how I ended up. And well, I shot my best group of the day. I shot a 400 with 25 X's. Frankly, this is one of the best targets I've ever shot in practice or competition. This rivals some of the best targets I've shot with my main competition pistol, my Hammerly 208. So by this point, I was thoroughly impressed by the Ruger Mark IV, but I decided that was a good point to stop it for that day. So the next time I shot this pistol was actually to capture the B-roll footage for this video, and I took it out at 50 yards in addition to 25 yards. So in Bullseye, when you shoot at 50 yards, you typically have 10 minutes to take 10 shots on a 50-yard target. Now the B6 target has the same size scoring rings as the B8 target that you shoot at 25 yards, but now it's twice as far away, so it's twice as difficult. The only difference is that the aiming area, the colored in portion of the target, is slightly larger with the 8 ring being colored in. It's an 8-inch bullseye. This is where I was sure that the issue I was having with the trigger breaking and the front sight moving was going to cause me issues, and the Mark IV would start to break down on me and stop grouping as well as it did at 25 yards. Much to my surprise, at 50 yards, it grouped just as well as it did at 25 yards. So on this first target, I shot 30 shots at a timed fire pace, again, about 4 to 5 seconds per shot. Now, I did have a couple bad shots on this target, but if I subtract the 3 worst shots to give me a 90% grouping, I had a 4 3/4 inch horizontal group and 4 3/4 inch vertical group. So again, that's about my average with my Hammerly 208, my main competition pistol. Frankly, again, amazing performance from just the stock Ruger Mark IV. And like I said, I wasn't shooting this one shot at a time. I was not making use of that full 10 minutes. I was shooting all these shots all in one go, 4 to 5 seconds per shot, and I was getting a group like that. So frankly, pretty damn good. Now, after I shot that target at a time fire pace, I decided I was gonna turn off the camera for a little bit and focus on shooting a true slow fire target. And I ended up shooting this target, these 10 shots at 50 yards. The group size was 4 1/4 inches horizontally and 3.5 inches vertically, and I didn't have any wild shots that went way outside of the group. So this is probably a better representation of what I can do with the pistol than that other group. By the way, you might notice that all the groups at 50 yards here are slightly off to the left. What I think was happening was the lighting conditions were significantly different from the first day and the second day that I shot these. And that lighting condition change was causing me to have a slightly imperceivable sight alignment error, which manifested as the groups being pushed a little bit off to the left. If this were going to be a serious competition pistol of mine, I would make note of that. I would note down the time of day, the lighting condition, and I would note down the adjustment I would make on my sights so that I know the next time I shoot on an overcast day like that, I should probably push my sights a little bit more to the right on the Ruger Mark IV. So after those shots at 50 yards, I went back down to 25 yards to get some B-roll footage of rapid fire. And I will say by this point, and partly due to dry firing this pistol the night before quite a bit, that the trigger on the Mark IV had actually smoothed out quite a bit and it was becoming a lot more consistent. And once the trigger had broken in, it's actually a pretty decent trigger. It's not super crisp. I don't really like a crisp trigger. I like a roll trigger to give you some feedback as you're pulling through the trigger. And that's sort of what it has going on here. Now it does still have a ton of over travel. So if I were to take this and turn it into a serious competition pistol, I would absolutely put in an over travel screw. Anyways, I captured that B-roll footage at 25 yards rapid fire, and it showed me nothing that I didn't already know about this pistol, that against all odds, and despite the trigger not being to my liking, and despite there being a wiggle in my front sight when I pulled the trigger, this gun shoots really, 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 really well. So does the Ruger Mark IV 75th Anniversary Edition shoot as good as it looks? Yes, absolutely. I shoot this pistol as well as I shoot my main competition pistol, which is considered to be one of the top of the line target pistols. It still holds a world record in one of the international disciplines. So I think that's pretty amazing, especially considering this is in its stock configuration and came in at just at $4 bills. You can find it for even under that. So pretty amazing performance for a stock Ruger Mark IV. And again, it absolutely breaks my perception of everything, that despite me pulling the trigger in dry fire and having a movement in my front sight, that it doesn't actually manifest in any real way on the target. I think what's happening is this pistol just has an incredibly fast lock time, which is essentially how fast everything happens after the trigger breaks, how fast the hammer hits the firing pin, hits the primer, hits the powder, expels the bullet out the barrel. So I think all of that must be happening before I can influence the barrel with my trigger finger due to the over travel. Again, if this were to be a serious competition pistol, I would put in an over travel screw immediately. There's also a few minor things I'd like to talk about this pistol just real quick before I give this pistol my full, wholehearted, unequivocal recommendation. So number one, grip angle. I don't prefer it. The grip is also kind of a little uncomfortable. And not only that, the thumb safety kind of digs into my thumb if I grip the pistol really, really high up. The 75th anniversary engraving on the back of the bolt is actually really distracting. I found it especially distracting when trying to shoot slow fire on those 10 shots at 50 yards. My eye just kept wanting to read the big 75 on the back of the bolt. Magazine disconnects are always stupid, and it's especially stupid on a pistol like this. This is a perfect pistol to give to someone that wants to learn how to shoot, that is a beginner. And one of the best ways to learn how to shoot is to sit there and dry fire, dry fire, dry fire. And having the magazine out makes it easier to recock the pistol, but then you have to reinsert the magazine to dry fire. And then having the magazine in to dry fire, when you pull the bolt back, it locks the bolt open, so then you have to send the bolt forward to pull the trigger. So it just makes dry firing a little bit more difficult. Again, if I were to use this pistol more often, that would be immediately addressed. Next thing, this might be really weird, and I might be one person out of 100,000 that has ever said this about the Ruger Mark IV, but I think I would prefer a heel release on this pistol instead of a thumb release. I find them to just be more suitable to target pistols, to be able to push the heel release, pull the magazine out, put it on the table, grab a new magazine, insert it, rather than, I mean, the magazines on the Ruger Mark IV just absolutely shoot out of there. So be mindful of that. And another thing about this gun, I spoke about the trigger quite a bit, but what I did not speak about was the trigger weight, because the trigger weight is much less important than the actual feel and experience of the trigger. And the experience of this trigger is that you come to a wall and then you have a big area of mush until it breaks. And that's kind of what I like. That mush or that roll or that creep, whatever you want to call it, gives me sort of a roadmap of how far I've pulled the trigger, how much pressure I've put on the trigger. So I know that as my sights are coming into alignment into the black, I'm going to be able to break that shot immediately as they center up in the target. I think a lot of novices are drawn to super crisp triggers, but to me a super crisp trigger doesn't really equate to a good trigger, because then you have no feedback. When you pull the trigger and you put 1 pound of pressure on the trigger, it feels no different than putting 3.5 pounds, which feels no different than putting 4 pounds, and then all of a sudden, bang, it breaks. So you have no frame of reference, and it's hard to judge exactly how much pressure you're putting with your trigger finger unless that trigger yields a little bit to tell you kind of where you're at. But of course, plenty of top level shooters use a crisp trigger, and a lot of other top shooters prefer a roll trigger or creepy trigger, mushy trigger, whatever you want to call it. For the record, the trigger weight on this pistol is about 3 pounds and 15 ounces. Here I have 3 pounds and 15.3 ounces on my weight set. And when I pick it up, it just barely picks it up and then breaks immediately after. This is really the only way to measure a trigger pull consistently, by the way. The little devices with the springs and digital readouts and stuff, they are subject to a lot of operator error. 1, 2, they rely on springs, and springs can eventually take a set and just not read as accurately as a set of weights, which are unchanging units of measurement. And the way you'd use this, of course, is you'd take your weight set. Right now I have 3 pounds, 15 ounces on it. I'd put it on the trigger right in the middle. And there is a technique to doing this to be a little bit more fair, but just to demonstrate on video, I'll do it up in the air. As you can see, that 3 pounds, 15 ounces just barely trips the trigger. If I remove 3.3 ounces from it, so it didn't pick up 3 pounds, 15 ounces, it does pick up 3 pounds, 12 ounces, but it just barely broke on the 15 ounces, so it's probably right at 3 pounds, 15 ounces. Now, to me, for a 22 pistol, 3 pounds, 15 ounces is pretty heavy. But this trigger doesn't feel that heavy because it's a hinged trigger, and I'm pulling on a pretty low portion of the trigger rather than directly in the middle of the bow, like where you'd measure it at. So I feel like if I were to take this pistol down to the minimum trigger weight that you're allowed in Bullseye for a 22 pistol, which is 2 pounds, and internationally it's 2.2 pounds or 1,000 grams, so for the 25 meter sports, that would be the minimum trigger weight. So if I brought it down to that, I bet you this trigger would feel extremely light. But again, the trigger weight matters so much less than the actual feel and experience of that trigger. And last but not least, I put a total of 250 rounds of CCI standard through this pistol for this test, and I did not experience a single stoppage, and my front sight is still rigidly attached to the pistol. Now, I'll probably shoot this gun a little bit more, and I'll probably have a follow-up or a part 2 in the future, so if or when it starts to experience malfunctions or that front sight loosens up, I'll let you know at what point that was. So anyways, do I recommend the Ruger Mark IV? Yes, absolutely. And I especially recommend the 75th anniversary edition, which if you can find them right now, I think they're discontinued, so you got to get them while you can. But they are really the best bang for your buck when it comes to a Target Mark IV. I'll say this again, all 22 blowback fixed barrel pistols are pretty much capable of the same level of accuracy if they're made by a reputable brand with a decent barrel. The differences between a Mark IV and a Hammerly and a Walther and a Pardini, what you're paying for is essentially everything else around it. How easy does the gun make it for the shooter to extract that mechanical accuracy from the gun? Does it have a grip that suits your hand shape? Does it have a trigger that you like? Does it have a long sight radius that you like? Does it have a sight picture that you like? What I was shocked by in this review was just how much of that mechanical accuracy I was able to extract out of a bone stock Ruger Mark IV with frankly not a great trigger, with frankly not a grip angle that I prefer, and really a gun I just don't have nearly as much trigger time on as something like my Hammerly, and I was able to shoot it just as well as that pistol. And really this gun is so good that this could be your very first pistol and the very last pistol that you ever own. It's that good. Anyways, that's my review of the Ruger Mark IV 75th Anniversary Edition. If you liked this video, go ahead and hit a like. I will probably end up with another one of these guns. Probably not another 75th Anniversary Edition, probably the 5.5-inch Target model, because I want to see if I can turn it into a dedicated competition pistol and do all the things I would want to do to it. And I don't want to do that to this one because this one's kind of nice looking. If and when that happens, I'll let you know, and I will probably turn it into a video series. If you're interested in learning more about the Ruger Mark series and the history of it, Lucky Gunner actually has a pretty good video about it. I'll leave a link in a card here and also in the description. Thank you again to Michael Scott Earl for sponsoring the channel, and thank you to my channel members who support the channel directly. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the join button next to the subscribe button. And also thank you all for watching, and have a great day.